The K&N Series 63 AirCharge cold air intake is for those of you that have a 2018 and up 3.6 liter JL that are looking for a cold air intake that's going to provide you with a few additional MPGs, a little more noise through the intake, and also a little bit more throttle response. A cold air intake is going to help provide a little bit more horsepower. However, it's going to do it at an RPM range where we don't spend a lot of time in our Wranglers, so do keep that in mind. This is going to be a fairly simple 2 out of 3 wrenches, and it's really only a 2 because you have to pop the grill off in order to get that factory air intake tube out, but we'll show you how to get this installed in just a second. So, like I said, anytime you're helping the engine breathe in or out easier, you can expect a little bit more power. It's going to be up there in that 4,500 plus RPM range, so when you are merging on and off the highway, you are going to see a little bit of an increase, but just driving around town, you'll see a few MPGs, some more throttle response, and a little bit more sound through the intake. Now, I usually would recommend a cold air intake for somebody who's not doing a lot of off-roading, or at least not doing a lot of off-roading in a wet area, because with this element and with this intake, there is the chance of getting a little bit more water into the engine. Now, that being said, this intake box does have some drain holes in the bottom of it, so if you were to get a little bit of water splashing in here, it would drain out through the bottom, which is going to be a pretty good thing. I am going to show you this intake next to the factory intake on a table in just a second, so you can really see a lot of the big differences here, but overall what you can expect to see with most cold air intakes is a larger intake tube and an air filter that's designed to let as much air into the engine as possible. It is important to notice that it's still going to be pulling air from the same area as the factory intake tube was. If you're looking for a true cold air intake, something that's going to pull unheated air from outside of the engine bay into the engine, the only choice is really going to be a snorkel. However, this is going to help by opening up the intake and providing as much air as possible. Now, K&N is known for building a really high quality product. This is going to come with that reusable air filter, so this does have a lot going for it. It's going to come in at that $310 mark, right in and around there, and I do think that's going to be a pretty good deal for you. There are going to be some more expensive options on the market, but most of those will include a metal intake tube. Metal is generally more expensive than plastic, so you would expect to pay a little bit more for that. That being said, there aren't a ton of these intakes out right now because the JL is still pretty new. I would expect to see some less expensive options come out in the near future. So I mentioned already that this is a 2 out of 3 wrench installation. Let me show you exactly how to get it installed. For this installation, we used a trim removal tool, a flathead screwdriver, and an adjustable wrench. We also use a 3/8 inch impact and a couple of different sockets, a 10mm and an 8mm. Also a T30 and T20 Torx bit, and a 5/32 inch Allen head drive with a couple of different adapters. The first step is removing the ambient air temp sensor and the crankcase vent from the intake tube, so we're going to do that now. So what we'll do now is just disconnect the wiring from the sensor. We'll get the sensor out of the intake tube in just a second here, so just by giving this a little bit of a pinch, we can disconnect the wiring. And then we'll also disconnect these clips from the rest of the intake, because all of that is going to need to be separated so we can get the factory intake out of the Jeep. To get the crankcase vent off, you just have to depress this small gray piece of plastic here and give it a tug. The next step will be removing the couple of bolts that hold the intake into place. There are going to be 2 up front here and then 1 around the side. We'll do these 2 first. The last bolt is around on the fender side here. We'll remove that. Now we'll remove the clips across the top of the grill to get the grill removed. With all the clips removed, we can pull the grill off. To release the clips, and take it off the Jeep. So the reason we had to remove the grill was to get this radiator support bar out of the way, and that'll give us access to this hidden screw here that hold the part of the intake that's almost like a ram air into place here. So once we have this bar out of the way and these two screws out of the way, that'll free up the rest of the intake. Now we'll remove the screws that hold the air duct in place. The final step is to release this clamp up here at the throttle body, and then we can get the intake out. Once you have the main air box out of the way, there's one last tube that we need to remove, and it pulls out like the rest of them, just out of a rubber grommet. Feed it through next to the radiator here and get it out of the way. Now that the factory intake is removed, we can put the grill back on. That doesn't need to be removed to get your new cold air intake installed. So we'll first install this radiator core support bar and then put the grill itself back in place. Now we'll assemble the new cold air intake. The first step is installing these small clips on the bottom here, and we'll do that with the included nut and bolt hardware. So you'll have your bolt, lock washer, flat washer. You have to put that from the inside, and then tighten the little plastic foot on from the outside. And you have one more of those over here. Next thing to install is this piece here, and that's just going to thread right into your intake tube, just like this. We'll use a small wrench to get that nice and tight. Now we'll remove our intake air temperature sensor out of the factory intake. In order to do that, you have to give it a little bit of a turn counterclockwise, but there is a bit of a stop here that keeps it from accidentally backing out. So you'll have to pry up on it just a little bit to get it over top of that stop, just like so. And then you should be able to give it that quarter turn. And then just wiggle it out. You do want to be very careful with these sensors because they are very fragile and easy to break, so take your time with that. Now we'll install our intake air temp sensor into the new intake tube, but in order to do that, first we have to install this rubber grommet. squeeze that down, get it into the hole here in the tube. Now that the grommet is installed in your new cold air intake tube, we just have to remove this small green O-ring from the intake air temp sensor, and then we put the sensor in the grommet. And then pop the sensor into the grommet. Next step in the assembly is to attach the air filter to the intake tube. I'll slide it right over top here, and you'll just tighten down the large hose clamp. After that, you can insert the filter inside of the air box and bolt the intake tube to the box. As you can see here, the flange lines up. You just have to orient everything properly. Take a look at the instructions, they'll tell you exactly how to do that. Once you have the intake tube oriented properly with the air box, you'll install the 3 screws and washers that hold these 2 pieces together. Now that we have the new cold air intake fully assembled, we can really see the major differences between it and the factory intake that we just finished pulling out of the Jeep. And the main differences, of course, are going to be in this intake area here. So this is a fairly wide tube, but it's also a fairly flat tube. And on your new K&N cold air intake, it's going to be a much larger round tube that is going to allow a lot more air into the engine. This is, of course, going to have a paper filter in it from the factory, where the K&N one is going to be a little bit more open, allowing a lot more air in, and it's also going to be both cleanable and re-oilable, so this should be the last air filter you'll need to install in your Jeep. Just pop it out, clean it, and put it back in instead of replacing it like you would with the paper air filter. And what really strikes me when I take a look at both of these intakes side by side is how overcomplicated and over-engineered the factory intake seems to be. You have all of these little chambers that are here to affect the sound of the intake. You have this little almost ram air intake here, but it doesn't directly attach to the air box. It just kind of feeds air in the general area of the main intake over here. There are all of these flex tubes and mounting points, and there's just a lot going on here. This K&N cold air intake is going to be very simple, and it's very clear to see when you look at it what its job is, and that's to give the most coldest air to the engine to provide the best performance. Now it's finally time to start the installation of our new cold air intake, and the first step is installing this rubber piece directly onto the throttle body here, this little rubber coupler, and you'll do that with the included hose clamps. So we'll set that in place and tighten it down. After that, we can set the next hose clamp over the other end of that connector, and finally get the cold air intake in place. So we can feed the intake into our connector piece here. I'm going to rotate it down into place, and it'll sit roughly in the same spot that the factory intake did, right there. Make sure that the bolt hole on the fender lines up, because we're going to be putting a bolt in there in just a second. And we can tighten down our other hose clamp. While we're here, we'll go ahead and plug in our intake air temp sensor here. And we'll also install our crankcase vent. That'll just push in place. The final step is to use one of the factory intake bolts to attach the new cold air intake to the fender. And that'll finish the install. So if you are looking for a high quality cold air intake option for your 3.6 liter JL, I would recommend this option from K&N, and you can find it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.